So, what we need to talk a little bit about today is what it means to be alive and how we as humans try to make order of the variety of life, and how do we put things into different categories so that when we have discussions or we try to develop deeper understandings of things, we can do so in a systematic way, right? So that it makes sense that we can group things together, either through relationships or similarities, and hopefully that means both, but sometimes it doesn't. And how do you know when it doesn't? So let's talk about the first question here. What does it mean to be alive? I'm going to put I'm going to number my questions. So these are the two questions I'm going to talk about today. What does it mean to be alive, and how do we as humans make order of the variety of life, or the biodiversity of life, right? That's a good word to know. Biodiversity. And this pertains particularly to your microscopes, because if we are able to identify the agent that might be causing disease, the pathogen that might be causing disease, we can treat it differently. And so depending on the type of organism, you might want to identify different drugs or treatment plans or strategies to remove that pathogen, right? So I think this is incredibly cool, right? So if you can identify the type of organism, you can treat the type of organism. That's what doctors do. That's what researchers do. And you are working to develop a tool, a microscope, that will help people do that more quickly. So let's talk about what it means to be alive. And so for the first question, what does it mean to be alive? We have this. It's actually kind of a difficult question to answer. As you can probably imagine, different people have different answers to this, and they're coming at this from different perspectives. Whether you're looking at religion and or spirituality, you could be looking at it from Western science, Eastern science, and again, I know I'm putting air quotes on Western and Eastern science, because there's not one version of those things. But we need to acknowledge that scientists have a really hard time defining this, because this is our own construct, right? Where this is our own definition of what it means to be alive. And depending on who you ask, you get a different list of these. A different list of the characteristics of life. Okay? So, I'm going to give you the most robust one that I have that will hopefully help you make sense of our own definitions of living things. And we use an acronym called DOG RACER. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and write these letters down. And then I'm going to write down what these letters stand for next to it. So, and then we can discuss that. And I'm not going to write everything down. Again, I'm expecting that you're writing this down. You can answer some questions, and might have questions of your own that you want to come to ask me about. So the D here stands for DNA, right? So DNA is that molecule of genetic material, right? So it's genetic material. I can spell genetic material that gets passed down from organism to organism, right? So, or from one generation to the next generation. And I hope you see the word gene in the word generation, which is a fragment of DNA. So it's the DNA that gets passed from one generation to the next. And we define that all organisms have their own DNA. The O stands for organization. That there's some kind of organization in an organism. So, really, in other words, that means that the different functions of an organism are carried out by different parts. So you have a respiratory system, you have a cardiovascular system, you have a digestive system. Those are different things doing different parts. And so you might say, well, I know that there's some really small things, Mr. Patel. There's some things made up of one cell. How do they have different parts that do different things. Well, those different parts we would qualify as organelles inside of those cells. Those organelles have different jobs to help keep that organism alive. G is growth and development. Alright, so these two words are not the same, and you need to know their scientific technical definition. So growth means to get bigger. So if we were to look at your cells, that's when your cells have just divided, they are small. Smaller than they would be right before they divide. So they have to grow, they have to get bigger. So it could be cells getting bigger and or making more cells. So my son, both of my sons are growing a lot. They're accumulating more cells. Development is going through the different stages of life. So we can consider that infancy to toddlers to I don't know if you want to classify preschoolers and elementary school kids as a different group. Then you've got teenagers, right? Young adults, middle age, elderly. These are all developmental stages. So I think of this sometimes with like a caterpillar and a butterfly, and metamorphosis. So the caterpillar is going through a developmental stage to become a butterfly, but as a caterpillar, it consumes food to grow, so it can get to the size that it needs to be to go through development. I don't know if that helps. Okay, so the other one is that they have to respond to stimuli. So a stimulus is something that causes a reaction. So if we had a living thing that did not respond to stimuli, then it would not be able to react to the environment or changes in the environment. So as it got hotter, it wouldn't be able to adjust its own temperature. If it got colder, it wouldn't be able to adjust its temperature. It wouldn't be able to react to changes in the environment, right? So that's not good. And so there's another important word here that's associated with this one, and it's homeostasis. Homeostasis. Stasis means static, or it stays the same. And so you might want to think about this as maintaining an internal balance. Maintaining an internal balance, okay? A is adaptations. I did not say adapt, because individuals do not adapt. Populations do. We'll talk more about that when we discuss some evolution, I hope soon. But we've got adaptations here, not to adapt. So that all organisms have adaptations that help them stay alive in this environment. If they lack those adaptations, they will not survive. They would not be alive for long, and definitely would not have survived through today. C is cell. You might see somewhere that it's cells, but I'm going to write just cell because we have unicellular organisms. So all living things have to be made of at least one cell. We've got energy and nutrients. So nutrients let's consider as matter, right? So all living things need energy and matter, so they need to be eating and converting that food into energy. Now plants, you might say, well, they don't eat, Mr. Bertel, they don't have a mouth, but they absorb their nutrients out of the soil and the air. They take some of that carbon dioxide, they take the water out of the ground, they use light energy, and they convert that into other nutrients that they can then convert into energy. So it's actually quite beautiful how plants do it, and we can talk more about that soon. And then the last R is reproduction. So all living things are the product of reproduction. There are two types, sexual and asexual. I'm just going to write those words. Sexual and asexual. Okay. So cells have to be able to reproduce. Sexual implies that there are two parents, but do not be fooled that all organisms need two parents. Some plants will self-pollinate, so their pollen or their sperm will pollinate its own egg. Some flowers have male and female parts. The idea here is that it really leads to variation. Oops. Variation. Whereas asexual reproduction leads to cloning. They both have mutations that could happen there, but variation allows for those differences, which might be really good for the adaptations, in that some organisms might be better adapted to survive than others, especially when the environment is constantly changing. So this is the list of characteristics of life, and this is how we define life, right? So these are the important things, but there are a couple of really interesting exceptions to the rules. So we say all living things have DNA, but there's an exception of red blood cells. I'm just going to call them RBCs, red blood cells. Your red blood cells had genetic material. They made so much protein, so much hemoglobin protein. Hemoglobin binds oxygen and carbon dioxide to move those molecules around your body as your cells need them. They make so much of that they actually push out all their other organelles, including their own nucleus. And so, are they alive or are they not alive? It's a good question. But they're part of a living thing, and they had genetic material, so that might help. Or they had DNA, excuse me, not just genetic material, but DNA. So I think that's kind of an interesting role there. And then the other thing with like energy and nutrients, I don't know if you've ever heard of these things called water bears, but these are really cool. These are my favorite water invertebrates, or favorite invertebrate plane. Oh, right. So these are these animals that are microscopic. They live in the water. We might be able to find some of these with your microscopes. And they can dehydrate and they can be dormant, not using energy and nutrients for decades, and then be rehydrated and be alive. So the question is, did they die and they come back to life, or were they living throughout that whole process but not using energy and nutrients? And if that's the case, should energy and nutrients be on this list? It's confusing, it's not nice and clean, and that is entirely because the natural world does not make order for us to make sense of it. Right? This is our attempt to try to organize a very complicated question of what does it mean to be alive. Okay? So I'm going to leave that there. And if you have questions, definitely come see me. But now we need to talk about the second question. How do we make order of the variety of life, or the biodiversity? So what I'm going to do is we need to talk about that organization, right? So I'm going to do a visual here. I hope this will help. So I'm going to apologize for my freehand lines. They're not very good. Let's see. I'm going to draw like a tree structure here. Okay, so I'm going to say that this here represents all living things. So that list that we just did, the dog racer list, will apply to anything underneath this heading, and viruses will go over here. Okay, so viruses are not considered to be alive. They don't always have their own genetic material. Sometimes they have not always their own DNA. So some of them are called retroviruses, and they have RNA instead of DNA. But they all require a host, right? So they're not large enough, and they don't do their own homeostasis. They don't do their own energy and nutrient acquisition. They need a host to do that. And when you get sick with a viral infection, you have become their host. And they latch onto the cell membranes of your cells. Depending on what kind of virus it is, it'll be attached to different types of cells. They inject their genetic material into your cells. It gets incorporated into your cell's DNA. You process it as if it was your own DNA. Inadvertently, you are making hundreds of copies of the viral DNA or in the viral proteins. And then they pop from the inside of the cell, releasing hundreds or thousands to repeat the process on other neighboring cells. And so you only see the symptoms of a viral infection, same with bacterial infection actually, once you hit a certain load. Once you get a certain amount of bacteria or viruses that show the symptoms, but you've already had it for a while, so you could have already been spreading it, and when you're showing the symptoms of it, really what that virus and bacteria are doing are trying to spread. They're trying to find some other host for the most part. Sometimes it might be too late, but that's usually kind of why you might sometimes get the sniffles when you might be infected with a virus or some bacteria. Anyways, let's talk about the all living things part. So I've broken this down into two categories, and I'm going to draw a line this way that's labeling this side as prokaryotes. So prokaryotic cells came before a nucleus. Add that little note there. And these on this side are eukaryotes. Okay? Eukaryotes. So these are things that have a nucleus. Eu means true. EU means true. So pro, no nucleus. Eu, true nucleus. And we've broken this down into two different categories. And so what we have on our list over here, we'll label these as eubacteria, or true bacteria. These are the bacteria you often think about. Then we have this other kind that's called archaeobacteria. And archaea simply means old. So these are bacteria that are around. We often say that they live in extreme environments, like really hot and really salty places. But that's not entirely true, because they live everywhere. They're just different enough from the eubacteria that for a long time we didn't know how to find them, because we needed another tool to be able to catch them and see them. So these are two different categories. There's a key difference between these, and I'm happy to answer that question if you like. But I'm not going to do this in this overview over here. And then this we're just going to label as eukarya. Eukarya. And what you should know is that these are the domains of life. This is, if you remember, I'll write a list up here. I don't know, hopefully you remember this. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species from middle school. These are the different taxa of life. This is the order scheme that we've adopted from Linnaeus to help us stay organized. And so this level, which Linnaeus did not give us, he gave us everything from kingdom down, is that first level. We have 3 domains of life, and then that breaks down into different components. So we've got, try to do my best here. So we have 6 kingdoms underneath this, under these domains. But you notice that there are 4 kingdoms under the eukarya, and 1 under eubacteria and archaeobacteria. So I'm going to go ahead and write eubacteria here. Archaeobacteria. So this is either nice or it's simply confusing that we have the same names for the domain and kingdom for the prokaryotic organisms, but for eukarya, I'll do this in different colors since this text is butting up to that one. For eukarya, there are 4 different kingdoms, and we've organized them in that way. So the ones that should stand out to you, I'm going to do plants and animals over here. So those, I think, should come to mind immediately. So there's the Plantae kingdom, the Animalia kingdom, and if you can't ever remember that, think of the amusement park at Disney World, the animal kingdom, right? And then there are 2 more that are really important, but often get overlooked: fungi and Protista, or Protists. Okay? And these are the 4 types of eukarya. So each of these types of cells have a nucleus because they're eukaryotic cells. And that's an important classifier. So if a farmer was able to identify the cells as a prokaryote or a eukaryote, you might have a different action plan to eradicate that disease. So let's talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of these organisms and why they're different from each other. I'm going to try to do this quickly. I'm not going to write out the full terminology. That's something I'm going to leave for you as you listen through the video. Especially because it's becoming apparent to me that some of you are not watching the video and just letting it play. And believe it or not, you're only cheating yourself because you're going to have an assessment on this soon. So, we've got plants, animals, fungi, and protists. Let's talk about the bacteria first. So both of these, I'm going to write a U for unicellular. They're both unicellular. We know that they're both prokaryotic. I'm going to write pro for prokaryotic. And they're on the size magnitude of about 1 to 10 micrometers. Okay, so these are really small. We said that these archaeobacteria are extreme, and they live in extreme environments like hot or salty places. So they're called extremophiles, or halophiles. Halo or halo refers to salt. All right, so they live halophiles or halophiles live in really salty environments. An example of eubacteria that you might be familiar with is E. coli, which stands for Escherichia coli. I hope you understand why we just write an E. So E. coli is an example of this. This lives in your intestines. And you could identify whether they're pathogenic or non-pathogenic E. coli. The eubacteria are also autotrophs. Some of them are autotrophs and some of them are heterotrophs. I'm not saying they're autotrophs and heterotrophs. Some of them are autotrophs, some of them are heterotrophs. Same here. Some of these are autotrophs and some of these are heterotrophs. Remember that autotrophs are organisms that make their own food, and heterotrophs have to eat other food. So in middle school, you might have referred to this as producers and consumers. We're going to get away from that language. We need more technical language. So when we're talking about these, let's start with the ones that you know most. So let's talk about animals. By definition, by our definition, animals are multicellular, so are plants. We know that they have eukaryotic cells, and it's important to not confuse eukarya and eubacteria. Okay, you need to play with this idea, talk about it, think about it enough that you get this straight. Okay, so multicellular, eukaryotic. Most animal cells are on the magnitude of 10 or just slightly more micrometers, and plants are usually about 100 micrometers. But the range is, there's a lot of variety in the animals and plants. Cells are well differentiated, which means that they look different because they have different functions, right? So that goes back to that characteristic of life about organization. So 10 plus micrometers, 100 micrometers. Let's see, what else do we know about these? Animals are heterotrophs. Plants are autotrophs, but you might be thinking, wait a minute, mister, what about a Venus flytrap? What about a pitcher plant? Well, these things are still considered to be autotrophs because they have photosynthetic components to them, but those plants are consuming insects. They are eating other food, but that's regarding nitrogen and not photosynthesis. So there's no nitrogen in the photosynthetic reaction, not directly anyway. So the nitrogen that the plants need to make their proteins they're not able to get them out of the soil because they're not able to compete with the other organisms in that environment. So what they do instead is they consume animals, digest them for their proteins, and then they use those components to make their own proteins. Isn't that cool? I think that's pretty awesome. So we've got those characteristics. I think that's going to be good enough for us, but I want you to also just think about animals as things that are not like you and I. So animals also can be considered, they're invertebrate animals, tiny microscopic ones like the water bear. But there's also things like coral and jellyfish or jellies, sea sponges. Those are all considered to be animals because they meet this definition of multicellularity and being a heterotroph. The other characteristic about animals is that no animal has a cell wall. Okay? Plants have cell walls. And you might want to write down, oh, I know they have chloroplasts too, but not all plant cells have chloroplasts. Okay? Like roots don't have chloroplasts. Okay, so fungi. Fungi could actually be unicellular or multicellular. So an example of a unicellular fungus would be yeast, like some you might add to bread to make it rise, or different types of mushrooms for our example of multicellular organisms. So we got unicellular and multicellular. They are eukaryotic. There's a variety of sizes of fungal cells, but the sizes that you should know are about 1 to 40 micrometers. And this is going to be key because most things that affect plant crops, depending on the goal of your microscope, this could change. But if you're looking for pathogens for a farmer to be centered around our theme of food for the year, fungal cells are most typically what infects plants, and this is the range of those fungal cells. So that might be your target for your microscopes. But fungi are not autotrophs, and students get this confused all the time. Think about yeast and mushrooms. Not green, not doing photosynthesis, not making their own food. Fungi, actually, a good way to think about them are as decomposers. So mushrooms grow on trees that are dead and have fallen. Or maybe not fallen, but they're certainly dead. And those mushrooms grow on the sides of them, and they're releasing chemicals that break down that tree into tiny little pieces. So if you ever go walking through the woods and you see like a row of trees, like in a pretty tight row, that's probably from a nurse log. So a log or tree had fallen there a long, long time ago. It decomposed, mostly because of fungi. It could actually be because of the eubacteria as well. Some eubacteria that are heterotrophic might be considered decomposers. But it released those nutrients right in that spot, which was a prime location for nutrients for future plants that have grown there. And that's what you might be looking at. So we've got, last category are the protists. And this is the grab bag. This is an interesting group because we know that anything in the protist kingdom is eukaryotic, but the thing about the protists is that it's for organisms that don't fit into these three other categories. And these definitions that I've written are human definitions, right? The animal kingdom doesn't say, well, you're an animal, you have to have all these things. You're a plant, you have to have all these things. There are weird exceptions like the Venus flytraps. There's a sea slug that is most definitely in the animal kingdom when it's born, but it's called the lettuce sea slug. This organism is able to eat algae, not digest the chloroplasts, but put those chloroplasts on its back so it can float in the ocean and do photosynthesis and make its own food. Bizarre, right? How cool is it, though? So anyways, this protist kingdom is like, where if it doesn't fit there, it goes here. So we're going to have a wide range of things, right? So we could be looking at unicellular, multicellular stuff, definitely eukaryotic. We have a range of sizes, so I'm not even going to tell you. It really depends. We've got some that are autotrophs. We've got some that are heterotrophs. We actually have some that are both, which is bizarre. And so I'll give you just a few examples to get you, maybe you can look these up. Amoeba, we looked at Volvox. Some of you looked at Paramecium under the microscope. There's another one called Euglena. All right, so that's a pretty good mix of different kinds of protists that fit in this category because they don't fit into these other things. Okay. And then the other thing that I didn't even mention yet are proteins, right? So we talked about bacteria as a pathogen, viruses as a pathogen, and we've also got proteins as a possible agent. Oh, excuse me, protists too, right? So sometimes protists, sometimes fungi are considered pathogens, but we've also got proteins as a possible source. And proteins are minuscule, right? So we're talking about the magnitude of nanometers, and we're not going to be able to see to that level. But you should understand that proteins are molecules, definitely not alive, but they are utterly important, incredibly important, to keep these other things alive. Without proteins, we would not be able to do their jobs, maintain homeostasis, or help us function throughout our life, and help with the reproductive process. So these proteins are, they're the machines of life, and they're really, really important. But some proteins, some bad proteins, can cause death in other organisms. And those, again, are really, really small because they make up components of the other pathogens. Okay? So I see that I'm at 31 minutes, just past that mark. I'm going to stop here.